Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's books are the Trylle Trilogy by Amanda Hocking, consisting of Switched, Torn, and Descend. I've got them as one book, so I'll talk about the series as one. When Wendy Everly was 6, her mother was convinced she was a monster and tried to kill her. 11 years later, Wendy discovers her mother was almost right. She's not the person she's always believed herself to be, and her whole life begins to unravel, all because of Finn Holmes. Finn is a darkly handsome newcomer, and every encounter with him leaves her deeply shaken, though it has more to do with her fierce attraction to him than she'd ever admit. He's also here to tell her the shocking truth. Wendy is a changeling, who was switched at birth, and he's come to take her home. Now Wendy's about to journey to a magical world she never knew existed, one that's both beautiful and frightening, and she must leave her old life behind to discover who she's meant to become. This has a 4.5-star rating on Goodreads. The books as a total are 1,025 pages and took me about 3 weeks to finish reading. I was pretty much reading them every day. I found it quite hard to put down each time I picked it up. I would definitely consider these books to be fantasy novels. I don't tend to read fantasy as much as I used to, since I was drawn to the inescapable void of teen fiction and young adult fiction. However, these books manage to maintain the fantasy theme strongly whilst still incorporating the romance content and relatable content that would be present in such teen and young adult fiction novels. I have a good friend who introduced me to these books, and it's basically how we became friends, so a shout out to Sky, my fiction buddy. I love that these books show clearly that no matter whether you're a mundane human or Trylle royalty, teenagers and adolescents face a lot of the same problems, especially in a personal, family, and social context. The storyline addresses various issues that occur during adolescent years in regards to self-discovery and identity, and portrays them in a fantastical context. In Switched, the romance starts off as a real slow burner. With every slow burn romance I've read, it seems painful at the time, but it makes it worth the wait, and the satisfaction of the eventual romance is so much sweeter. Plus, it makes things more realistic. The first romantic interest that Wendy has is a real slow burner, and just over 200 pages in, he admits that he felt jealous after seeing her being affectionate with another guy, and I just wanted to shout, finally! It's written so dramatically, but I love that whether you're Trylle or not, many adolescents do face the same issues, and the conflict that takes place between Wendy and her mother, as she gradually becomes more confident in who she is as a person, makes for pretty entertaining reading. The emotional tension had such a significant effect on me, to the point where you just want to scream at the characters. It's funny how you can think of something as being so detrimental, but at the same time can see how a parent is simply trying to do their best for their child, which is another example of setting ordinary problems against a fantastical background. The first kiss between two characters that I shipped right up from the off is perfect. Emotions are high, no one's thinking straight, but in a moment of confession, they finally establish where they stand with each other, and I had a classic fanboy moment. 22 chapters in, everything is going swimmingly, and then we get a bombshell. It makes you want to know more about the story, not only in terms of the plot, but the history of the Trylle, and more significantly, Trylle royalty. Something I have to commend Amanda Hocking for is how well the fights and battle scenes are written throughout these novels. In order to make for good reading, the ratio of action to description is critical, and I think that these books have nailed it. In Switched, where the Vitra execute an attack, I actually ended up holding my breath unconsciously at the time, at more than one point, before realising that I wasn't breathing. Torn, the second instalment of the Trylle Trilogy, picks up straight off from where Switched ended, and you're able to dive back into the story without any difficulty. The theme of relationships is quite prominent at the beginning of this novel, and the relationships that you're introduced to in Switched, the first novel of the Trylle Trilogy, become extremely tense as they're put under considerable strain. So I have actually read this trilogy before, I'd say around almost 10 years ago, and I've absolutely loved rereading. However, I noticed something this time that I didn't before. I find that with a lot of stories, if you strip them down and take them out of their context, they often come back to the same thing. An example of this is Shakespeare. A lot of storylines from Shakespeare's works are recreated and rewritten in novels today, but you may not be able to recognise it easily as they use a different story and a different context. I often find that some of my favourite books incorporate more than one of these storylines. You won't be surprised to know that my favourite Shakespeare play is Romeo and Juliet, and taken out of context, boy meets girl, they fall in love, and due to their feuds that their families have, they can't be together. This story is recreated in so many romance novels today. Two people meet, they fall in love, and for whatever reason, family, career, where they live, they can't be together. I would definitely say that some form of that story is retold in this book, and I absolutely love it. I love reading characters fight for each other. Amanda Hocking. So, only a few chapters into Torn, there's a huge plot twist that I'd completely forgotten about. I had a jaw drop moment. It's the final line of a chapter, so I've got to carry on reading. The thoughts that go through Wendy's head are very similar to what you as the reader are most likely thinking. In chapter 8, things get extremely tense. Wendy and Elora have never had the best relationship, but things are about to come to a head, as Wendy is a character who can deal with things quite bluntly at the best of times, so I'm excited to find out what's about to happen, but I'm also slightly apprehensive. So it was only a matter of time before I started shipping two characters that I felt I probably shouldn't, and I actually think that's a sign of excellent writing, when two characters aren't written as having outright feelings for each other, but subtle undertones, whether intended by the writer or not, are enough for the reader to read something into. I was halfway through reading Torn when I realised how easy these books are to come back to. Obviously, I didn't read the whole trilogy in one sitting, much as I would have loved to. Sometimes you can read a book, and each time you come back to it, you have to reread the last couple of pages just to jog your memory, because the chapter doesn't continue straight on from the last. Each time I put this book down, the next time I picked it up, I was able to continue reading with no problem. Most of the chapters carry on straight on from the last, and maybe it's just because I loved these books so much, but whenever I wasn't reading, I was thinking about the last chapter I'd read, so I had no problem diving back into the story each time. It was also at this point that there was a slight plot twist. Things have gone awry with Wendy's primary love interest, and much like Wendy, I'd been rather down since. As the reader, you're led to believe that things haven't and don't change for quite a long while, and then a relatively new acquaintance lets Wendy know that things aren't as she believes. And again, similar to her reaction, I was made so happy. I quickly realised that it was because their relationship hadn't been addressed for some time that had me somewhat excited, but then I remembered how things were left between them the last time they were together, and that put a slight dampener on things. But knowing what a headstrong character Wendy is, I was pretty eager to find out how things were going to go. Chapter 15 is called Capulets and Montagues, so I don't even need to explain how much that had me buzzing, but if you aren't aware, that's a Romeo and Juliet reference, which now enforces my theory of a subtle Romeo and Juliet side storyline that bubbles underneath the surface throughout these books. The Romeo and Juliet idea is pretty much confirmed a few chapters later when Wendy makes it quite clear who her current love interest is. But then, of course, Amanda Hocking hits us with another bombshell. As princess, Wendy has basically been planned an arranged marriage by her mother with someone who is not one of her romantic interests. The way that Amanda Hocking did this is so clever because this character isn't an outright villain, and they are close to Wendy, but as the reader, I can't imagine that you'd be a big fan of theirs. I wasn't. However, in a situation where something might have happened to them, I was actually quite worried and hoped that they'd be okay. Immediately I thought, why do I feel like that? I don't particularly like them. But that's why it's brilliant writing. Wendy cares about them, and it's for that reason that part of me still wants them to be okay. At the end of chapter 24, Amanda Hocking drops another bombshell, which I felt further enforced my whole Romeo and Juliet theory. Oh my goodness. So, two characters that I mentioned I shipped, but their romance had never been overly obvious. Well, Wendy walks in on them kissing, and the whole scene is perfect. It's rather hilarious. There are a few things that come close to my appreciation of a character's sarcasm or sass in a book, and when Wendy starts owning who she is, it's just brilliant. The people who thought they could talk down to her because they knew that she felt out of place in the Trylle community end up being put in their place. And once Wendy becomes more comfortable exercising the authority that she has, it's great. Okay, so something else I loved about these books was how often I changed my mind on who I thought Wendy should be with. At first I thought, am I really that naive? But honestly, it's just the way that the relationships are written. It's wonderful. Everyone has their highs and their lows, and these books communicate clearly that no one person is perfect. I completely forgot about one part. I've told you before about times where I have to put the book down and just take a moment. But at this part, I literally slammed the book down, and to say that I gasped again would be a major understatement. Amanda Hocking, if by any chance you see this, Tove Krona, I just love him. And oh my goodness, Wendy and Finn's second kiss. The tension, the drama, I just loved it. The transition from Torn to Ascend isn't unlike the first and second books. Ascend pretty much continues straight on from the end of Torn. There are so many points in this that I refer to as plot twists, but that's just my opinion, as they're things that I didn't see coming. However, speaking of which, barely a few pages into Ascend, the final book of the Trylle Trilogy, a character returns who makes things all too exciting again. Oh my goodness, there's so much I want to say, but I won't spoil anything. Basically, at the end of Torn, I was fairly curious about this pairing. A few pages into Ascend, I was pretty much thinking, I will go down with this ship. It was also at this point that I became more conscious about how much of the book I had left, just because I didn't want it to end. It's weird because once I realised what I'm about to mention, I realised that it had been a significant theme throughout all three books. But as I started reading Torn, I realised that the coming-of-age theme is prominent throughout all three books, especially in regards to accepting responsibilities that you don't feel you're ready for or that shouldn't be your responsibility. Wendy has to accept a lot of responsibilities and concepts that are otherwise alien to her and live up to the expectations of pretty much everyone that she meets. It's crazy how the relationships change throughout these novels. The transitions are gradual, so it's realistic. However, I ended up resenting characters I'd loved to begin with and growing to love characters that I'd felt next to nothing for. But I just think that's a sign of brilliant writing. Some of the characters I didn't love in the beginning, I wouldn't exactly describe as villains, but they certainly weren't the protagonist's friends. I honestly believe that some of the best and or scariest villains are the ones that you can understand, the ones that you almost feel are justified in their actions. I think that secretly, most of us readers love a good villain. Oh my goodness, chapter 5 of Ascend, my jaw dropped. I started reading again at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's what these books did to me. This came as such a shock, but I loved it. I loved that throughout these books, loose endings are sometimes left loose for quite a while, and in this case, I'd forgotten about a particular situation, but then it's reintroduced to the main plot and storyline, and to say that I gasped again would be a major understatement. The scene that follows made me feel so many things, and after all that's happened, I'm then not completely sure how I feel about their quote-unquote relationship. Amanda Hocking, I can't love you anymore. That was just too much, especially for a morning read. I just want Wendy to be happy. So there's a wedding, I won't say whose, but I loved it, and the whole thing is made so much more entertaining given what the reader knows about the happy couple. But of course, given what I'd read up to this point, it wasn't all too surprising to find that the wedding wouldn't go smoothly. So I thought that this was another sign of quite brilliant writing. Towards the end of the wedding, at the reception, when the music slows, there's one sentence. Then he walked in. My first thoughts went to a particular character, then I thought, no, it's going to be this character. Then I continued reading, it was neither of those characters, and I gasped again. Let me establish one thing before I continue, so that you don't think ill of me. The person I ship Wendy with at this point is not her husband. But given what the reader knows that other characters don't, I feel that I'm fully justified in doing so. This person and Wendy end up dancing together at the reception, and things are so tense. It's wonderful. However, I am a huge Tove fan. I just think he's great, and I love the relationship that he and Wendy do have. The morning after the wedding is quite entertaining. Wendy ends up in a room with her now husband, her unofficial ex, and her flirtationship counterpart. So the tension is high anyway, and then Wendy gets landed with a bombshell that she's expected to deal with as princess. It's as though we get to enjoy the wedding and are then reminded of the current circumstances. Chapter 10 made me realise something else about these books. There aren't any characters I'd say that I really hate. There are, of course, characters I'm not so fond of. However, when they're actually put in harm's way, I realise that I don't want anything to happen to them. I just feel as though that's another sign of brilliant writing. Oh my goodness, almost kisses between characters that I ship are possibly some of the most frustrating things to read, but they are so effective. The tension is just ridiculous. Right, so I hit chapter 13 and start to realise that things are getting real now. By fictional standards, anyway. You can tell that the climax of the plot is drawing near, and things are likely to go one of two ways. However, due to the plot twists in these books, I'm not exactly expecting anything in particular. I have an ideal ending in mind and know how I'd love things to play out, but I'm not counting on it. No! Amanda Hocking, stop sinking my ships. This is possibly the longest that Wendy's had something with someone that I ship her with, and you just had to take that away from me. I almost felt that I was reading, at this point, in desperation of things somehow turning around for everyone. Oh my goodness, just let them have their moment. They were basically going to kiss, and only get interrupted by Wendy's unofficial ex. I was so annoyed. Not only that, I'm so not his biggest fan at this point, and then the events that follow, I was so frustrated, but every time that Wendy puts Finn in his place, knowing her worth not just as queen, it brings me so much joy. I do love Wendy. Wendy sets the social and psychological issues that many adolescents and adults deal with against the fantasy background of Trylle royalty. In the midst of a mass post-battle recovery, Wendy ends up discussing exactly what happened on her wedding night when she shared a bed with her husband for the first time. The conversation just made me think, they may be magical, but they're like us, really, right? Teens are teens. Or maybe that's just what I secretly want. Oh my goodness, Tove. Really, Amanda? Really, just as I've said that I love this guy, I just think he's great. I do believe that perfect characters are unrealistic, and every character should have their faults. But chapter 15? No. I had no idea where I stood with Tove after that. However, it did add fuel to my OTP fire. Amanda Hocking! At this point, I'm just thinking, you can't keep doing this to me. You can't keep leading me on and ripping things away from me. I'm reading this, melting how much I love it, but at the same time I'm thinking that because of how much I love it, well, this probably isn't going to last, is it? Oh my goodness. So, the chapter ends beautifully. I suppose it was slightly bittersweet, but it pulled at my heartstrings. That's how I'm left feeling at the end of the chapter, and then the start of chapter 17 is just a huge reality check, both for Wendy and for the reader. No way. Tove told his mum. Tove told his mum what had happened. Not only that, but she apologises to Wendy on his behalf. Oh my life, no, that ruined my image of Tove, and I was devastated because I thought so highly of him. So the same morning, a lot more happens for Wendy, and at the same time that I started thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to cry, Wendy starts thinking, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Oh my goodness, there are plot twists, and then there's this trilogy. The end of chapter 17. You can't end a chapter like that. I've been reading all evening at this point, and thought when I started the chapter, I'll have a break after this one. Well, that didn't happen, because now I needed answers. Oh my goodness, really, Elora? I know she said that she does truly care for Wendy, but after everything, she chose that of all times, to become motherly and maternal. In my eyes, she had previously redeemed herself, but she just irritates and frustrates me again at this point. Okay, I retract my previous statement. Honestly, Amanda Hocking, these character arcs make me feel bad for making judgments. Not that it justifies any of her actions in particular, but now I do actually believe that Alora genuinely cares about Wendy. When the chapter ends, part of me felt I needed some time to process and come to terms with everything that had happened. But chapter 19 was right there. I also ended up thinking I could finish this trilogy that night. This was at 7:30. Oh my goodness, no, Tove. Does Wendy really have to say it? Honestly, this might be the first time in the trilogy that Wendy genuinely makes it utterly clear how she feels in regards to potential lovers. That sounds harsh, I know. Tove breaks my heart at this point when he confesses how he really feels. He essentially says that he's jealous of someone because they get to love Wendy, but if you understand the context, I was on the verge of tears, but I didn't cry because there were people present. The end of chapter 19. I honestly didn't think that my heart could take much more. Chapter 22. Really, Wendy? Really? Wendy is a character I loved from the start. I felt that I could understand her and relate to her. I've supported almost all of her decisions so far, but this, to me, it seems slightly ridiculous. I practically live for the pre-battle or mid-battle kisses between characters that I ship, and the tension and suspense genuinely feels like it can't get any worse. You know, the end is near, and I feel that it's going one of two ways. But given how much I've thought wrong throughout these books, I didn't read too much into it, pun intended. But chapter 24, why do authors have to do things like that? Amanda Hocking, I loved them. And like so many authors before you, you've trampled on my heart. Thank you for the trauma. My family turned and stared at me as a result of the rather dramatic breath of relief I took as I continued reading. The end of the last chapter, I felt, was perfect. Right down to the final line, I was absolutely thrilled to find out that there was an epilogue. I love that right down to the last page is fighting for equality in regards to class, jobs, power, race, authority, and more, I feel is a theme consistent throughout the entire trilogy. I love that in the last pages, all loose ends are tied up. You can come across books sometimes where towards the end, you can sometimes tell that the author's panicked and thought, oh, I need to clarify what's happened to this character and this, that, and the other. However, there's a really nice flow towards the end as you draw near to the final pages. As I said, I was of course thrilled to find that there was an epilogue. It was a breath of relief to read a bit of perfection in regards to Wendy's circumstances. Usually I'd say that perfect isn't realistic, but after the emotional roller coaster and trauma that the reader has experienced at this point, I think a bit of perfect is just what's needed and deserved. This edition of the complete Trylle Trilogy that I have includes a bonus short story entitled Ever After, which skips forward in the story by about a year and a half. Honestly, it put my mind at ease, that everyone was happy and I knew that I didn't have to worry about these characters anymore. There is more that you find out about what happens for Wendy that I won't spoil, but it made me so happy. Amanda, thank you for using Oliver. I feel privileged. I am so happy for Tove and Willa and the person she ends up with. I'm so happy for them. Being able to love who you want to love is most definitely a theme at the end of this book, and I love how it's portrayed. I love so much how everything comes full circle. Also, a shout out to Amanda Hocking. I tweeted her as I was reading these in reference to a book Wendy finds written in Trillic, which is an old language they don't really use anymore. I asked if it was ever a widely spoken language between Trylle, and she tweeted me back. She said, funny you should ask. This is explained more in depth in the Ompt Origins, mostly in the Ever After, so I'll have to be giving that a read. These books are a perfect blend of fantasy and teen fiction. Given how much I bury my head in teen fiction and young adult fiction, these books have reminded me of my love of fantasy. So, fantasy fans, these books are for you. If you do lean more towards the teen fiction side of things, I would still recommend that you give these books a read. There's a lot of relatable content, even if it's taken out of relatable context. Thank you again so much, Sky Jane, my fiction buddy, without whom I wouldn't have found these books. And thank you, Amanda Hocking. If it wasn't for the Trill, Sky and I probably wouldn't have the friendship that we do. I'm in danger of getting slightly soppy, so like and subscribe, hit the notification bell to know when to join me next time, where I'll be reviewing the Blood of Eden trilogy by Julie Kagawa. Happy reading, guys!